I still remember the first time I heard the word Renaissance. I was a young apprentice then, working in a small workshop in Florence, my hands always covered in dust from grinding pigments or shaping wood. My master, an old but wise painter, would often speak of a rebirth, a time when people began to think differently, to see the world with fresh eyes. At first, I did not understand what he meant. But as the years passed, I began to see this change with my own eyes. I was born in a time when most people believed what they were told without question. The church was the center of life, and knowledge was limited. Books were rare and expensive, written by hand and kept in monasteries. Only a few people could read, and even fewer had access to learning. But something was changing. Slowly, quietly, like the first light of dawn. Florence, my city, was becoming a place full of new ideas. Wealthy families, especially the Medici, began to support artists, writers, and thinkers. They believed that art and knowledge were important, not just for religion, but for life itself. Because of their support, workshops like ours were busy, and young apprentices like me had the chance to learn more than just basic skills. One day, my master showed me an old book. It was not a religious text, but something very different. It contained writings from ancient Greece and Rome. I remember touching its pages carefully, afraid I might damage something so precious. "These," my master said, "are the voices of the past. We are bringing them back to life." This was my first real understanding of the Renaissance. It was not just about new ideas, but also about rediscovering old ones. Scholars began to study ancient texts, learning about philosophy, science, and art from long ago. They called this humanism, a way of thinking that focused on human potential and achievements, rather than only on religious beliefs. As I grew older, I began to notice changes everywhere. Artists were no longer painting only flat, simple images. Instead, they started to use techniques like perspective to create depth, making their work look more real. I remember the first time I saw a painting that seemed almost alive. It was as if I could step into it. In our workshop, my master taught me how to mix colors carefully, how to observe light and shadow, and how to study the human body. To understand beauty, he told me, you must understand nature. This idea was new and exciting. Instead of copying old styles, we were encouraged to look at the real world, to study people, landscapes, and objects. I also began to hear about great thinkers and inventors. There was talk of a man who studied everything, from painting to machines to the human body. His name was Leonardo. People said he filled notebooks with drawings of flying machines and detailed sketches of muscles and bones. To me, he seemed like a symbol of this new age, a man who was not limited by one field, but curious about everything. But the Renaissance was not only about art. It was also about knowledge, spreading more quickly than ever before. Around this time, something incredible happened: the invention of the printing press. Before this, books had to be copied by hand, which took a long time. But now, books could be printed in large numbers. This meant more people could read, learn, and share ideas. I remember the first printed book I ever saw. It was simple, but to me, it felt like holding the future in my hands. Knowledge was no longer locked away. It was beginning to reach ordinary people like me. Still, not everyone welcomed these changes. Some believed that new ideas were dangerous. They feared that questioning old beliefs would lead to chaos. And sometimes they were right to worry. The Renaissance was not always peaceful. It was a time of change, and change often brings conflict. Yet for me, it was a time of excitement. Every day felt like a discovery. I was no longer just an apprentice following instructions. I was becoming part of something bigger, a movement that was changing the way people thought, created, and lived. Looking back now, I realize that the Renaissance was not a single moment, but a long journey. It began quietly, with a few curious minds, and slowly grew into a powerful force. And I was there, in my small workshop in Florence, watching the world wake up. I did not know then how far this rebirth of knowledge would spread, or how deeply it would shape the future. But I could feel it, like a rising tide. Something new had begun, and I was ready to follow where it would lead. As the years passed, the changes I once only sensed began to grow stronger and clearer. Florence was no longer just a city of trade and business. It had become a living classroom. Everywhere I went, I heard discussions about ideas, discoveries, and new ways of understanding the world. It felt as if people had awakened from a long sleep, eager to learn, question, and create. By then, I was no longer just an apprentice. My hands had become steady, my eyes more careful. My master trusted me with important tasks, and sometimes even asked for my opinion. But more than my skills, it was my curiosity that had grown the most. I wanted to understand everything, the meaning behind the art, the ideas in the books, and the changes happening around me. One afternoon, I visited a small gathering of scholars. They met in a quiet room filled with books, maps, and strange instruments. I remember feeling nervous at first, as I was just a craftsman among learned men. But they welcomed me kindly, asking about my work and my thoughts. That day, I heard a word that would stay with me forever: humanism. They explained that humanism was about studying humans, their thoughts, their abilities, and their place in the world. It was different from the old way of thinking, which focused only on religious teachings. Humanists believed that people could achieve great things through education, observation, and effort. They studied ancient texts from Greece and Rome, not just to admire them, but to learn from them. They believed that the past held wisdom that could help build a better future. For the first time, I realized that knowledge was not something fixed. It could grow, change, and improve. This idea changed how I saw my own work. Painting was no longer just about decoration or religious duty. It became a way to explore life, emotion, and truth. I began to observe people more closely, the way they moved, the expressions on their faces, the way light touched their skin. Every detail mattered. Around this time, I also noticed how artists were becoming more respected. In the past, they were often seen as simple workers, but now they were being recognized as thinkers and creators. Wealthy patrons invited them into their homes, not just to produce art, but to share ideas. Art and knowledge were becoming deeply connected. In our workshop, we started experimenting with new techniques. One of the most important was perspective. My master showed me how to draw lines that seemed to meet at a single point in the distance. At first, it was difficult to understand, but when I finally saw the result, I was amazed. The image no longer looked flat. It had depth, as if I could walk into it. This simple technique changed everything. It made paintings more realistic and more powerful. It allowed us to tell stories in a way that felt alive. I realized then that art was not just about what we saw, but how we saw it. Another important change came from science. People were beginning to study the natural world more carefully. Instead of accepting old beliefs without question, they started to observe, test, and experiment. I heard about scholars who studied the stars, trying to understand the movement of the heavens. Others examined the human body, learning how muscles and bones work together. At first, these ideas seemed strange, even dangerous. Some believed that questioning traditional knowledge was wrong. But others argued that understanding the world was a way of honoring creation. This debate was everywhere, in workshops, in homes, in the streets. One evening, I met a young student who showed me a printed book filled with diagrams of the human body. I was both fascinated and uneasy. The drawings were detailed and precise, showing muscles, bones, and organs. It was something I had never seen before. To paint the human form, he told me, we must understand what lies beneath the surface. That moment stayed with me. It made me realize that art and science were not separate. They were connected. Both were ways of exploring truth. The printing press continued to spread knowledge at an incredible speed. More books appeared every year, covering subjects from history to mathematics to philosophy. Even people who were not scholars could now access information. I began to read whenever I could, slowly improving my understanding of language and ideas. With this growth of knowledge came a new sense of confidence. People began to believe in their own abilities. They no longer saw themselves as small and powerless, but as individuals capable of learning and creating. This spirit could be felt everywhere, in the art, in the discussions, even in daily life. But not everything was easy. With new ideas came disagreements. Some feared that too much change would destroy tradition. Others believed that progress was necessary, no matter the cost. I often found myself caught between these views, unsure of what the future would bring. Yet, despite these tensions, I felt hopeful. The world was becoming larger, more complex, and more exciting. I was no longer just living in my city. I was part of a wider movement of thought and discovery. As I stood one evening, looking over the rooftops of Florence, I realized how much had changed since my childhood. The city seemed brighter, not just with light, but with possibility. Knowledge was no longer hidden. It was spreading, growing, and shaping the future. And deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning. The more the world around me expanded with knowledge and beauty, the more I began to notice its shadows. The Renaissance was not only a time of light, it was also a time of tension, fear, and difficult questions. For every new idea that brought excitement, there was another that brought doubt. By this time, I had begun to travel beyond Florence. My master believed that to truly grow, I needed to see other cities, meet other artists, and experience different ways of thinking. So, with a small bag and a heart full of curiosity, I set out on my journey. My first destination was Rome. The city felt ancient and powerful, filled with ruins that seemed to whisper stories of the past. Walking among broken columns and great arches, I began to understand why people were so fascinated with ancient Greece and Rome. These were not just old stones. They were symbols of a time when art, architecture, and knowledge had reached great heights. In Rome, I worked with another painter for a short time. He was different from my master, more serious, more focused on perfection. He spoke often about balance, proportion, and harmony. Art, he told me, must reflect order. It must show the beauty of structure. Under his guidance, I improved my understanding of the human form and composition. Every line had meaning, every shape a purpose. But Rome was also a place of strong authority. The church was powerful there, guiding not only religion, but also knowledge and art. Many artists worked on religious projects, painting scenes from the Bible with great care and devotion. While these works were beautiful, I could sense a quiet limit. Some ideas were welcomed, while others were not. During my stay, I heard stories of thinkers who had faced trouble for their ideas. Some had questioned traditional beliefs about the world, suggesting that the earth might not be the center of the universe. These ideas were shocking to many people. They challenged long-held views and created fear among those who believed change could lead to disorder. One evening, in a small gathering, I listened as a scholar spoke softly about the movement of the planets. He used simple tools and careful observation to explain his ideas. Though I did not fully understand the science, I could feel the importance of his work. He was not just studying the stars, he was changing how people saw their place in the universe. But he also spoke with caution, always lowering his voice when discussing certain topics. That was when I realized that knowledge could be both powerful and dangerous. To discover something new was exciting, but to share it could come with risk. After Rome, I traveled to Venice, a city unlike any I had seen before. Built on water, it was full of movement, boats, merchants, travelers from distant lands. Venice felt alive with trade and culture. Here, I saw how the Renaissance was spreading beyond Florence and Rome, reaching new places and mixing with different traditions. In Venice, art had a different style. The colors were richer, the light softer, the atmosphere more emotional. I worked briefly with a group of artists who focused on color and feeling rather than strict structure. At first, it confused me, but soon I began to appreciate their approach. It taught me that there was not just one way to create beauty. It was also in Venice that I saw the true power of the printing press. Shops were filled with books, histories, poems, scientific writings, and translations of ancient texts. People gathered to read and discuss ideas openly. Knowledge was no longer controlled by a small group. It was becoming something shared. I spent many evenings reading by candlelight, slowly improving my understanding of the world. The more I read, the more questions I had. And the more questions I had, the more I realized how much there was still to learn. Yet, even in this vibrant city, there were tensions. Not everyone agreed with the changes taking place. Some feared that too much freedom of thought would weaken tradition and authority. Others believed that knowledge should have no limits. I often found myself thinking about these opposing views. Was it better to protect old beliefs or to explore new ones? Could both exist together? These were not easy questions, and I did not have clear answers. As my journey continued, I began to understand that the Renaissance was not a simple story of progress. It was a complex and sometimes difficult transformation. It brought beauty and discovery, but also conflict and uncertainty. One moment, in particular, stayed with me. I was sketching in a quiet corner of Venice when an older man approached me. He watched my work for a while, then said, "You see the world differently than those before you. But remember, every new way of seeing comes with responsibility." His words remained in my mind long after he left. I realized that being part of this new age was not just about learning and creating, it was also about understanding the impact of our ideas. As I prepared to return to Florence, I felt changed. I had seen great beauty, learned new skills, and discovered ideas that challenged everything I once believed. But I had also seen fear, resistance, and the limits placed on knowledge. The Renaissance was not just a rebirth, it was a struggle between the old and the new. And I was standing in the middle of it, trying to find my place. I did not yet know what role I would play in this changing world. But I knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back. When I finally returned to Florence, I was no longer the same young apprentice who had once stood quietly in my master's workshop. My hands were more skilled, yes, but more importantly, my mind had changed. I carried with me not only sketches and notes from my travels, but also questions, doubts, and a deeper understanding of the world. Florence welcomed me again with its familiar streets and lively spirit, yet something felt different. Or perhaps it was I who had changed. The city was still full of artists, thinkers, and merchants, but now I could see more clearly how all these parts were connected. The Renaissance was no longer just something happening around me. It was something I had become part of. My master, now older and slower in his movements, listened carefully as I shared my experiences in Rome and Venice. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he simply smiled and said, "Now you begin to understand." In the following months, I took on more responsibility in the workshop. I was no longer just assisting, I was creating. My first major painting was a challenge I both feared and welcomed. It was a religious scene, as many works still were, but I approached it differently. I used perspective to create depth, studied real people for my figures, and paid careful attention to light and shadow. When the painting was complete, I stepped back and looked at it for a long time. It was not perfect, but it was mine. More importantly, it reflected the ideas I had come to believe in, that art should not only tell a story, but also reveal truth and emotion. Around this time, Florence continued to grow as a center of learning. Schools and academies began to form, where students could study not only religion, but also mathematics, literature, and science. Education was becoming more organized, more accessible. Young minds were being trained to think, not just to remember. I often visited these places, listening to lectures and discussions. Though I was not a formal student, I felt welcome among them. Knowledge no longer belonged only to a select few. It was becoming something shared, something alive. The influence of the Renaissance was also spreading beyond Italy. Travelers brought ideas to other parts of Europe, where they began to grow in new ways. Art, science, and philosophy were no longer limited to one region. A movement that had begun quietly was now reaching across borders. One of the most powerful changes I witnessed was in the way people saw themselves. In the past, many believed their role in life was fixed and unchangeable. But now, there was a growing belief in personal potential. People began to ask, "What can I become? What can I discover?" This shift in thinking was not small. It changed everything. It encouraged exploration, creativity, and ambition. It led to new inventions, new art, and new ways of understanding the world. I remember one particular day when a young boy came into the workshop, much like I once had. He watched me paint with wide, curious eyes. After a while, he asked, "How do you know what to create?" I paused, thinking carefully before answering. I observe, I said. I study. But most importantly, I ask questions. He nodded, though I was not sure he fully understood. But I saw in him the same curiosity that had once driven me, and I realized then that the Renaissance was not just about great artists or famous thinkers. It was about people like him, and like me, learning to see the world differently. As the years passed, I continued to work, to learn, and to teach. My master eventually passed on, leaving the workshop in my care. It was a moment of both sadness and pride. I carried forward his teachings, but also added my own. Looking back on my journey, I can see how much the world had changed. Knowledge was no longer hidden. Art was no longer limited. People were no longer silent. The Renaissance had given us something powerful, the courage to think, to question, and to create. But it also left us with a responsibility. Knowledge, I learned, is not just something we receive. It is something we must use wisely. The same ideas that bring progress can also bring conflict if not guided with care. As I stand now in my workshop, watching a new generation begin their own journeys, I feel both hope and wonder. The world is still changing, still growing. The rebirth of knowledge did not end. It continues, in every question asked, in every idea explored. And I, once a simple apprentice, have become a witness to this transformation. This is the story of the Renaissance, not just a time in history, but a turning point in the way we see ourselves and our world. A rebirth not only of knowledge, but of the human spirit. In this story, you learned not only history, but also useful English expressions. Let us look at some important idioms and phrases. The first expression is a new dawn. It means the beginning of something new and hopeful. For example, we can say that the Renaissance was a new dawn for knowledge and art. Another useful phrase is open one's eyes. This means to understand something clearly or to see the truth. In the story, traveling to different cities opened my eyes to new ideas. The third expression is think outside the box. This means to think in a creative and different way. Renaissance thinkers and artists did not follow old rules. They thought outside the box and created something new. Another phrase is step into something, which means to enter a new experience or situation. In the story, I stepped into a world of learning and discovery. Finally, no turning back means reaching a point where you cannot return to the past. After learning new ideas, there was no turning back for me. Now, let us practice simple conversation to improve your speaking skills. You can read these aloud or practice with a partner. One question is, what is the Renaissance? You can answer, the Renaissance is a time of rebirth in art, science, and knowledge. Another question is, why was the Renaissance important? A simple answer is, it changed how people think and helped spread knowledge. You can also ask, what did you learn from the story? A good answer is, I learned that curiosity and learning can change our lives. Another useful question is, do you like learning history? Why? You can say, yes, I like it because it helps me understand the world better. Finally, you can ask, what would you like to learn in the future? A possible answer is, I would like to learn more about art, science, and new ideas. Practice these questions and answers slowly and clearly to build confidence. Thank you for listening to this story, The Renaissance, Rebirth of Knowledge. I hope this story helped you learn both history and English in a simple and enjoyable way. If you want to improve your English step by step, please support my channel. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, Read and Learn English, for more easy stories, listening practice, and useful vocabulary. Keep practicing every day, and you will see your progress. Learning English is a journey, and you are moving forward with every story you hear.